Okay, we're live. And here's my intro. Okay, Prof Noakes is joining us back to the Real Meal Revolution for a little cameo. But I wanted to give a proper intro because everyone sees Prof Noakes as like the banting guru. I don't think people necessarily realize, and this is more like a point of clarity because everyone who I've heard talk about Prof Noakes over the last 10 years has said stuff like he's not a doctor, he's a sports scientist. so before I let you speak, I need to just say this. So Prof Noakes, medical doctor, okay, PhD in like an actual PhD, and then also given an honorary PhD or honorary doctorate, professor, the Order of Mapungubwe, which is basically the South African version of being knighted. Knight Prof Noakes, and the author of 11 books, 2 of which I was very fortunate to be involved in. So Prof Noakes is a scientific badass and a truly great South African. Very well known for banting, but things that people don't know about Prof is that he is also famous for challenging the beliefs about rugby, for challenging beliefs about cricket, for coining the phrase hyponatremia, or at least challenging beliefs about hydration, coining the phrase anticipatory thermogenesis, which is also an insane phenomenon with Lewis Pugh. So you've made a significant contribution to your field. So welcome back to Real Meal Revolution. And I think the first question I'd like to ask you is, how do you feel about being branded as a controversial scientist if you've managed to make such a profound impact on your field?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jonno. Thanks for the introduction. I might just add that I have a Doctor of Science, which is the highest degree given by the University of Cape Town, and which always makes me laugh because I get criticized daily on Twitter for not being a scientist by people who haven't the first clue what science is. So science, you see, the problem is that we've given up on science, medical science. When you go to medical school, you're no longer allowed to question. You're told in an authoritarian way, this is the truth. And that's what we discovered when we wrote the book. We were challenging the authority. And of course, what happened? So they took me to court on that one. And so because they couldn't accept that what I was saying was true because they weren't allowed to say it. So science is about skepticism. It's questioning. Yeah. How do we go forward if we don't question? And I was always interested in the questions. I mean, I said I'd much rather write the textbook than learn the textbook. And you reach a point in medicine where you decide, are you going to become a specialist? What that means literally is you take a textbook with about 3,000 pages and you learn every word in that textbook because you could be questioned on anything. And I remember there were if you come to a doctor with a temperature, there are about 100 causes. And that's called pyrexia of unknown origin. And the person who can remember the 100th is a really clever guy, you see. But if you only remember 99, you're not so clever. And what I've learned in my career is that the best thing to have to get into medicine is a photographic memory, an eidetic memory. And the 2 people who influenced my career the most had eidetic memories. And they were brilliant lecturers and brilliant writers, but they were clueless about creativity. They couldn't create new ideas. And so that's what happens in medicine. The people who become the leaders have this eidetic memory and they can't create. Why should you? If you can pick up a book and remember everything in the book, why do you have to create anything new? But I wasn't like that. I didn't have an eidetic memory. So I had to go and work things out. The only way I could remember things is if I could work out how it logically fitted one to the other. And so that's why I'm skeptical, because I want to know, but when you say that, where's the evidence? And how does it link to other information that I have? So the scientist who isn't skeptical, who isn't maverick, is by definition not a scientist. Yeah. If you're not controversial, you're not a scientist.
Okay, well that's quite clear. I mean, there's irony in that because then the people who are because you're skeptical, and as a result, people are skeptical of you, and it's like no, I'm supposed to be skeptical. Sure.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about sports science and the summit, and I'm really excited to touch on those. But I want to just have a recap for everyone on diabetes, because to my surprise, I had a conversation with a relative of mine about a month ago, and he said to me, Noakes was very outspoken about diabetes 8 years ago or 10 years ago. And he said he would show us the science. And where's the science? And obviously I've had my head in it the whole time. And so I didn't realize that it was actually I would say a failure on the press, because when everyone thought you were wrong, you were very popular in the news. Everyone wanted to write about you. And like, now that we all know low carb diets reverse diabetes, no one wants to hear about it. So I mean, I'd love you to comment on that as well, but perhaps you could share with us just a little bit about how diabetes research and reversal has progressed since Real Meal in 2013.
Yeah, so I mean, it's progressed in leaps and bounds. And in fact, the American Diabetic Association now acknowledges that low carbohydrate diet is one of the preferred treatments, if not the preferred treatment, which is 100% change. So to get back to your point, when I won my case, no one mentioned it. And my colleagues at the University of Cape Town said I shouldn't have won, I should have been found guilty. But they hadn't bothered to come and read the information. But why do they say that? And it remains simple. And I can guarantee the person who spoke to you has a massive conflict of interest, because he is controlled by the pharmaceutical industry and he must prescribe insulin for his diabetic patients. And for someone in that position to mention the word Noakes or low carbohydrate is suicide. It's professional suicide. So, and now we come back to the science. These people do not know. They never read the science. They have no clue. I remember when I was giving one lecture and a guy who tackled me afterwards, and he's one of the captured scientists, local captured doctors. He said, "But you don't know the literature." And I said, please, please. How many books have I read on this topic? Thousands. How many articles do I have? I pick up 3 or 4 new articles every day. I've got tens of thousands of articles in my index. And these people have none, because they don't have to have any, because when they go to work each day, they repeat exactly what they said yesterday and what they said 10 years ago, and nothing changes. Can you honestly tell me that medical practice shouldn't change? Of course it should. So the answer, let's go back to your question. So Atkins in the 1990s is reversing diabetes with this diet. And the story really takes off. What really changed everything was one day in Duke University, Eric Westman, Dr. Eric Westman, who's running a clinic there, a lady comes into him and he says, "You've lost a lot of weight." So she said, "Yes, I went on the Atkins diet." So he said to her, "You can't go on the Atkins diet, it's going to kill you from cholesterol and so on." So she said, "Doc, why don't you measure my blood cholesterol concentration?" So he said, "That's a good idea." So he does it and it's normal. So then he says, "Oh my gosh, how can you have a normal cholesterol eating a high-fat diet?" So then he decides, well, I better go and see Atkins. So he could have done 2 things. He could have just discounted it. But because he's more of a maverick and he questions, he said, "Okay, I must go to the source." So he flies to New York and meets Atkins. When he meets him, he's convinced this guy's a quack before that, because that's what he's been told. He reads the Journal of the American Medical Association, which says that Atkins is a quack and the diet's dangerous. Anyway, and then he sees all these patients and they've reversed their diabetes. And Atkins introduces them and they say, "Yes, hello, Dr. Westman. My name is so-and-so. I reversed my diabetes on this diet." So Eric says, well, that's no good. Where's the hard evidence? And Atkins says, "Well, I don't have any. I've got all these people." So Westman said, "Give me the money and I'll prove that you are reversing the diabetes, or at least I can judge it." So Atkins sets up a foundation, funds Westman, and Westman then does the first trial, and they show reversal of type 2 diabetes with this diet, and it's published in 2006. Well, it might as well have been published in Chinese, because no one took any notice of it. But however, what next happens, as you know, is that Eric Westman and Jeff Volek and Steve Phinney are all working together. Eventually, Jeff Volek and Steve Phinney go to Sami Inkinen, who's just retired billionaire and who has insulin resistance, and he's an athlete, and he follows the law of running. By the way, he trains himself on the law of running. And they say, we reversed diabetes in these 20 people, but we'd like to do a study of 100. So Sami said, 100? What's 100? I want 100 million reversals. So then they started the company Verta Health, and they started in 2015, 2016. And it's now already rated a company worth $3 billion or more already. And that's how it's grown, because they're providing services that reverse type 2 diabetes, and they publish the evidence. So and they found that 90% of the patients could stop taking insulin. And that's the key. Once you get off insulin, you're going to start improving your health. So there's that study. And then there are about 10 other studies which have been published showing reversal. And we did it here, as I think you know.
Yeah.
We had 28 people came to us and said they'd reversed their diabetes by reading your book, and which is amazing. How do you reverse your book diabetes just by reading a book? Anyway, it turned out that 75% of them had retained, they were in remission. Some had reversed completely, some like myself still take medication. So it's not called complete reversal, we're in remission. And 7 hadn't, because they hadn't followed the diet. And what we found in that study was that the people who reversed were the ones who got control of their eating disorders, i.e. their cravings and so on. And that was the key. If you controlled your cravings, your diabetes reversed. It wasn't taking the medicines and taking the insulin and controlling your glucose. No, you can't control your glucose if you can't first control the eating disorder, which is what's driving the diabetes, and which is the food addiction, which I had, and which I'd guess most people who are obese have got that problem. Yeah. So there is a bucket of evidence. And in fact, now it's criminal negligence. It's criminal negligence for that person to say that to you if he's a medical doctor, because he should be treating every patient with this diet. Because if he doesn't treat them like that, they will die of the complications. And no one ever talks about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that a doctor would have to admit if they agreed with the new model of treating diabetes is that they've prescribed the wrong way in the past, and it's caused harm, or at least not helped their patients in the past. And so the older the doctor, the more fatalities under their belt. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's very difficult to admit that you've made that error. So you forced me into to acknowledging my error, because I realized that I'd written this book, The Law of Running, which advocated the high carbohydrate diet. And now we're seeing it. We're seeing all the diabetes occurring in the athletes who were following my diet 20, 30 years ago, and who haven't learned that if you're going to eat a high carbohydrate diet and you're insulin resistant, you're going to get type 2 diabetes in due course, as I did, and unless you change. And so for me, it was fortunately, I wasn't directly in medical practice at the time, so perhaps it was a little bit easier for me to acknowledge the problem. But I must say, I never believed what would happen, for telling the truth, and to see what happened as a consequence of that.
Well, and I suppose, definitely there's been good and bad, but I would say it's a net positive. Definitely a net positive. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, Prof, you said that you spoke about researching. Now, obviously, I know you've started the Noakes Foundation, and then there's Nutrition Network, and then there's ABSA. Could you just explain how those organizations work and what they are?
Yeah, well, it's all up to you again. You're responsible because I'd be nicely sitting in retirement if it wasn't for you. I could go out to the beach and surf all day, but now I have to work. So you'll recall that when Real Meal Revolution sold so many copies, we got huge royalties. And as a consequence, I didn't want to take that money to my own account. So I formed a trust, and that trust then we decided to put into form the Noakes Foundation. And it was you who told us, you need to employ Jane to run the Noakes Foundation. And so we did that with no idea of where it would lead. Originally, I was so angry at that time about the science of it, because I could see the science was clear. So I said, well, let's bombard the world with science, and particularly the people in South Africa who'd attacked us, because I could see they had no interest in science whatsoever. And I think, as you know, you were at the trial. And the people that we were arguing with had absolutely zero interest. The dietitians had no interest in science at all.
They wanted blood, hey? They wanted blood.
That's it. They had no knowledge about the low carbohydrate diet, and they suffered as a consequence. So my goal at the time was, okay, let's form the Noakes Foundation. It's now going to do lovely new research on the benefits of the low carbohydrate diet. the reality is we did do some good studies, but we found that they're incredibly expensive to fund a research team to do research of that kind. It's hugely expensive. And we eventually began to realize that probably the answers have been provided. The answers about the benefits of the low carbohydrate diet are now in the literature, and they are being provided by people like David Ludwig at Harvard, who's done some fabulous studies, which we could never, ever have considered doing them. So there are a lot of really good scientists doing really good work on the low carbs. And when I went on trial, there wasn't all this information. Today, it's just overwhelming. As you know, every day, and the Nutrition Network sends this around, every day there's a new study talking about the benefits. I mean, yesterday it's Tourette's syndrome can now be treated with, well, that's a paper, you know, so not saying it's going to be cured, but the point is that people are starting to use it in many different neurological conditions. Wow. So then we decided, well, let's just go ahead. So we started on this, and then Jane had this great idea of having a conference and filming it. And that was the start of the Nutrition Network, and that she and her team have taken that to incredible heights. And the goal of Nutrition Network is to change one physician, one meal at a time, so to speak. And so that the focus is on the patients, on the doctors, not on the patients.
Yeah.
And that's been hugely successful. And then, of course, the criticism, which you will be well aware of, is that the Banting diet is just expensive. You know, you're going to eat meat all day, it's going to be expensive. So the Eat Better South Africa campaign is to put that to rest, and that you can eat a healthy diet on considerably less money than you might if you're just eating steak every day. And so the Eat Better South Africa campaign has been hugely successful. We've had programs in 10 communities in the Western Cape, and the results have always been stunning, because these people have the worst diet. And as soon as they cut the sugar, if there was one thing to do, it would be to cut the sugar. And that would be very, very helpful.
Yeah, I want to touch on the price thing for a bit, because I often take a little bit of ownership over the price thing. Because when we put out the book Real Meal, one of the things that everyone saw were the recipes, and they thought the recipes were the diet. And people were saying, like, I can't afford to eat lime and sumac rump skewers every night for dinner if to be on this diet. And one of the things I have to continuously say to people is, you know, the diet is in the lists and the framework, and not in the recipes. The recipes were there to make it look sexy and cool, but it's actually about the lists. And if you look at the lists, you can have mince and boiled eggs, or even you know, offal and cauliflower, and that's still low carb and much more affordable than, you know, short rib braised in red wine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So now you're holding the summit, and so there is the summit coming up, and your talk is on. It's actually almost like a blast from the past, because you're going back into sports nutrition, but tapping into a little bit of the new science. What is the new science that you are going to expose at the Nutrition Network or at the World Nutrition Summit?
Yeah, so you know, I pick up plenty of enemies around the world, and one of them, I was offered to debate this particular person in the Journal of Physiology, and so I was asked to write my rebuttal to what she was going to write, but I didn't know what she'd written, but I knew pretty much what she was going to say. So I prepared my document and sent it to them just for them to look at, the editors of the Journal of Physiology. And they said, no, it's too personal. And we have a long relationship of these battles. And you must know, as in the sports sciences, it's hard. The battles are not easy. There's a lot of anger and hostility. And I was subject to that for many years, because I didn't support the narrative about drinking sugary drinks during marathons and so on.
Yeah.
So anyway, eventually they said, no, it's too personal. We can't publish it. You see, we're a journal of physiology. So I wrote back and I said, yeah, but you're not a journal of medicine. So you don't understand the harm that's being caused by what you are advocating. And that's why you need to see the broader picture. Anyway, the next week I got an invitation to publish an article in one of these other journals. And so I started writing it. And over a period of 6 months, I went through the literature, and then I realized that slowly, as I wrote this article, I suddenly realized where we'd been wrong. And we'd been wrong because the idea that muscle glycogen limits performance was based on experiments done in 1967, which was before I started medicine. And everyone had accepted the data as pristine and absolute. In other words, there was one singular cause of fatigue. It was related to carbohydrates, but it was muscle glycogen. So once you ran out of muscle glycogen, you were in trouble. So sorry, there's a guy. Wait, can I just cut there? Is this going live?
We're live right now. Hey? Do you
okay, well, I must
you can
just
handle it if you want.
I must just ask my wife to let this guy out. So just wait. I'll be 1 minute.
We'll keep the suspense going here. We'll be back in 5, everyone. Go for a coffee, a quick loo break, whatever you need. Why don't you post, if you're watching this live, drop a question in the chat, and we'll see if we can ask some bonus questions for Prof when he comes back. This is totally 2022. 5 years ago, unacceptable. Today, I'm surprised there isn't a grandchild running around.
Just leave the box, okay? Just take them, but leave the box. Oh, you get them next week. Yeah. Just toss it there. Go. Right, I'm back again. Sorry about that.
I have to tell you,
so she couldn't let the guys out.
You know, usually when things go quiet in a live, we lose viewers, and the number has stayed like exactly the same the whole time. So you obviously left on a cliffhanger. Yeah. So, right. So you were talking.
Now at least I can concentrate. This guy was walking from one window to the next to attract my attention. So now I can concentrate again.
All right.
Okay.
So muscle glycogen. You were on muscle glycogen.
That's right. So, you know, the irony is that when I started medicine, the first studies I ever read about was this muscle glycogen model method, and we were the first to do biopsies in the Western Cape, or in South Africa, in Africa probably. And I was probably one of the very first guys to have muscle glycogen measured after a marathon in South Africa. So we were right up there because we knew glycogen's everything, and that it's the singular cause of fatigue. And that's the belief. And the belief is that if you don't have enough glycogen in the muscle, it can't contract properly, and so you get tired. So one of the reasons why I was asked to write this article was because with a group in Philadelphia, we did one of the best studies on carbohydrate loading. By the way, we have already done a study in Cape Town of carbohydrate loading where we used a placebo, which means that the people got carbohydrates and then some of them didn't get carbohydrate. They got a placebo that seemed to be, they thought it was carbohydrate, but it wasn't. And there was no difference in performance. And no one ever quotes that paper. So really? Here was a study on carbohydrate loading making no difference. And I'll explain why it didn't make a difference in due course. So we did the study with a group in Philadelphia, and they're just a magnificent group by Philip Prince, by the way, whose father is head of the fire services in Cape Town. So when the UCT had that fire, he was the guy who's investigating it. But anyway, his son is in Philadelphia and he's an unbelievable good researcher. So what he did was, as the experiment, we had guys run 5K time trials repeatedly on the treadmill in the laboratory. First, they did one diet, either the high carbs or high fat. Then they had a washout period, and then they went on to the other diet. And it was beautifully controlled. In other words, we knew that when they had changed the diet, they stuck to the diet, and we could prove it. And so then they did their 5K time trials, And there was no difference, no performance difference whatsoever. And what's more, these were not weak athletes. They were quite good athletes. They were better than 88% of all American athletes, and probably the same number of South African athletes. So we proved with one simple experiment that 88% of runners in the world probably will not benefit from carbohydrate additions, carbohydrate loading. So when I'm asked to write this editorial, that's in the back of my mind. I'm thinking, well, actually, these guys could run fast without burning much glycogen. So therefore, maybe the glycogen is not so important. But anyway, so I start reading this article, preparing this article, and I go through all my old slides. And then I notice it, that if you have an hypothesis, you must exclude all other possible explanations. So now the Scandinavians who did the studies and published them in 1967, what they did was they put people on a high carbohydrate diet, a mixed diet, and a low carbohydrate diet. And then they had them exercise on a cycle, you use bicycles in those days, for as long as they could. And they found that the people who had the most glycogen exercised the longest, and those who had this lowest starting glycogen stopped the earliest. So it's cut and dried. It's all glycogen. Yeah. But they didn't exclude the other thing. And the other thing is blood glucose. We know that if your blood glucose falls, you get into trouble and your exercise performance drops. And I can give you many examples. Bruce Fordyce is classic. His whole career was based on discovering he developed hypoglycemia in one of the comrades. His father gave him a bunch of sugar in Coke, and he suddenly picked up places. And that inspired him to continue to want to become good. Oh, wow. Conversely, Johnny Halberstadt in the Comrades, you can see him. There's a picture of him in the 1979 Comrades where he leads the race right through till about 5Ks from then, and he starts walking. And then he's given a Coke, and you can see him drinking the Coke, and then off he goes again. Within 2 minutes, he speeds up and off he goes again and just misses winning the race. So we know that blood sugar is important, and you can correct it very quickly. So in these studies, everyone, where their performance went down, so did their blood glucose go down. So I said, but they never excluded that, you see. Why? Because they're going to measure glycogen. They've developed this technique. It's glycogen's everything. Blood glucose, anyone can measure blood glucose. So why are we going to bother with that? That's so 1920s. We don't want to talk about that in 1967. So the blood glucose gets forgotten. So then I go through all the literature that's been published, and every single time, where there's a difference in performance between a group who are eating a lot of carbohydrate or taking carbohydrate when they're exercising, if they perform better than the control group, then in every case, the control group's blood glucose fell. So you can't exclude that it wasn't the blood glucose dropping. Then I show a whole lot of studies where they measure glucose continuously and performance at the same time. And you see, as soon as the blood glucose starts to fall, the performance starts to fall. And therefore, that is acting in the central governor model, that what's happening is the blood glucose is falling, and the brain is not stupid. The brain knows what's going to damage me is if I don't get enough glucose. Because for most people eating high carbohydrate diets, the brain is glucose dependent. It can't burn ketones, the alternative. And so the brain starts to measure and seeing, oh, my glucose is going down. Where's the glucose escaping to? That's what the brain says. Where's all this glucose escaping? It's going to the muscles. What's the solution? I must slow the athlete down to save myself. And then eventually you collapse and fall over, unconscious. And then the glucose will very quickly rise again and your brain will be saved. So going through the whole, I present all the evidence. And one of the best studies was done by my great friend, David Costello. And what he did was he took a group and he had the high carb loading versus non-loading. And then they fed carbs or no carbs. So you had people with high carbs before, given carbohydrates during, and they performed very well. Their glucose stayed nice and high. The group that did worse, of course, was the group that started the exercise with low glycogen and didn't have any carbohydrates. And their performance tailed off. They hung in for 70% of the exercise. Then their glucose starts to fall and their performance drops off. But the group that surprised them, and they couldn't explain it, was the group that started with low glycogen and was given carbohydrates. They performed as well as anyone, even though they burnt less glycogen and they finished with less glycogen on board. So they should have performed worse, but they performed exactly the same as the group that started with the high carbohydrates. And they couldn't explain it. And the clear answer was, you protected against hypoglycemia. And then when retrospectively you go and look at all the studies, that's exactly what it shows. So now I'm getting this. So sorry, let me just finish up and then I'll come back.
No, this is gold. No. Keep going.
And then, you know, the beauty of Twitter is, ching, article comes through.
Yeah. Someone
has developed a running mouse model where the mouse has normal muscle glycogen stores. So its muscle glycogen storage capacity is absolutely normal. But guess what? It overstores glycogen in the liver. Fabulous, because now you can test what's more important. Is it muscle glycogen or is liver glycogen? And guess what? These mice run forever and they outperform the normal mice with normal liver glycogen. And they control their blood glucose and they run substantially longer. And at exhaustion, the muscle glycogen is identical, but the liver glycogen is higher and the glucose is higher in the mice with this special adaptation. So they conclude, there it is. It's liver glycogen that's what's important in exercise. It's not the muscle glycogen. So anyway, sorry, just to finish the story. So then the bit I'm working on, and I don't think I'll have it ready for the conference, but I'm working on it at the moment. So now I know we did some fabulous work, my team, Andrew Bosch and Sandy Welton and John Hawley and Laurie Rauch. They did some of the best carbohydrate studies in the 1980s and the 1990s. They were absolutely leading the field. And just at the end, when I converted and so on, they'd been studying low carbohydrate, people with low muscle glycogen, and then they would infuse glucose into them to see what happens. And they were trying to explain, why do people develop hypoglycemia during exercise? But we terminated it, unfortunately, because if we were to start again, I'd know exactly what to do. But however, so I asked the question, you cannot protect muscle glycogen during exercise. It just burns up like this. And the more you start with, the more quickly you burn it up. And I said, but why wouldn't you want to protect muscle glycogen? You'd think that you want to spare it so you can exercise for longer. Yeah. And then I asked the question, what about blood glucose? You see, which is separate. So when you're exercising, you're breaking down carbohydrate in the muscles, and then you're releasing it from the liver into the bloodstream. And that's being used as well to fuel the activity. And what I observed is, we know that as you exercise for longer, your rate of carbohydrate oxidation, that's the total carbohydrate oxidation, goes down because you've got less glycogen to burn. And I asked the question, but what happens to blood glucose oxidation? Because now you would not want that to go up during exercise. You'd want it to come down, obviously, because otherwise you're going to become hypoglycemic earlier. And we have the data. Those guys had done the data in the 1980s, in the 1990s. And guess what happens? It doesn't matter what you do, if you carbohydrate load or you carbohydrate deplete, etc. As your muscle glycogen is coming down, your blood glucose oxidation is going up. And that's a disaster, because that means you must become hypoglycemic. So then I asked the question, why wouldn't you protect blood glucose? Why would you allow it to rise substantially? And anything you do, it's still going to rise. And the answer is because that's the obligatory brain glucose that you require for your brain to function. And every textbook, we know you need obligatory glucose at rest. So both of us have obligatory glucose requirements now. Our liver is providing the glucose, but it's at such a low level because we're burning fats as well. You wouldn't really notice it. But now if we exercise you, then we notice that there's an obligatory amount of glucose being oxidized, and it can only be because of the brain. So that's what's happening. So now we go back to those original studies. where they said the muscle glycogen is the critical component that stops you exercising. So once you run out of muscle glycogen, you can't exercise any longer because the muscle glycogen is obligatory. It's not. It's the blood glucose that's obligatory. So what is that? So that we haven't yet proven that, but the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that that is the case. Why is that so important? Because it puts the carbohydrate loading, forget about it. It's not necessary. And it emphasizes the value of fat loading because your brain doesn't need as much glucose. So even if you weren't to take glucose during exercise, you would exercise for longer because your brain would be able to burn ketones and less carbohydrates or less glucose. So carbohydrate loading finished and dead. It's gone. All you need to do during exercise is just have a touch of glucose to keep your blood glucose normal. And remember, as you know, there's only 5 grams of glucose in the bloodstream. 5 grams. It doesn't take much. So then I'll finish up with my story. So when I was training quite hard for 1 comrades, I used to do other races and I wouldn't carbohydrate load because I'd want to run a long way without loading. And one of the races was the race from Grahamstown to Port Alfred. It's about 56 or so kilometers. And I had a second that day and I told her, I said, listen, I'm not taking carbohydrates. I want to see how far I can go without it. But if I get stroppy with you, you must just stop me and you must force me to take glucose. Force me to take glucose. So off I go. And after about 40 Ks, I get stroppy. And my running speed just dropped, poof, like this. And so I said, I don't want your glucose. Go away, etc. She said, you told me I must give you glucose. And by the way, this was when I was promoting this glucose story tremendously. So anyway, I said, okay, I'll take some. So I took it. And within 10 minutes, I was running the fastest I'd ever finished a race. Now, this is carbohydrate depleted. And I just took, and it was almost as if the brain said, gosh, I've been relieved. Now I can really let you go. And that was, I mean, that's an epic race. I remember it absolutely vividly. I couldn't get tired at the end and all I'd done was take about 50 grams of glucose about an hour and a half before the end of the race. It was just astonishing.
So look, apart from the 1,000 questions that I can see in the chat, I'm keen to hear what the actual implications are on. So what it sounds like you're saying is it's more important to be like liver loading than carb loading. So like preparing your liver for exercise rather than your muscles. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So you want to make sure that you get lots of glycogen in the liver, or else reduce the amount of glucose that's being used from the bloodstream. And the only way you can do that is become fat adapted. But my point is, sorry, this is another very important point. In all the studies where glucose helps, it's like 100 grams is all you need.
Okay.
But yet, if you go in carbohydrate load, you'll eat an extra kilogram or 2 in the last 3 days. So why do you need a kilogram or 2 of carbohydrate when in fact during the race you only need 100 grams? And that's the discrepancy. So we've wasted our time and we've harmed people by telling them, like, I'm sorry, I did, not you. I've told them to eat kilograms of carbohydrates in the last 3 days before the race, when all they need is a few 100 grams during the race and they'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, so there's a few more questions come up there, and one of them for me is around getting just overwhelmed there actually, but like so questions we've got are about like pre-workout, during workout, post-workout. Does that all fall away just because it's
absolutely
sitting in your body anyway?
I mean, yeah, because your performance will only be affected if your blood glucose starts to fall. And it's very difficult to get your blood glucose to fall if you're eating normally. And like, say you have breakfast, I mean, it's almost impossible to become hypoglycemic without doing 3 or 4 or 5 hours of exercise. You know, it's funny because when we tried to prove hypoglycemia was an issue, I mean, the very first comrades that Bruce won, 1981, we were in the medical tent measuring blood glucose levels at the finish. And we found plenty of hypoglycemia just by the by. And but Bruce wasn't one of them. So you know, we were thinking along those lines. And then we studied people in marathons in the 2 oceans and another marathon in Cape Town. But we could never find hypoglycemia, even though these people, well, they were taking carbohydrates. But by the time the carbohydrates came along, just a few Cokes on the road and you wouldn't become hypoglycemic. So it's very difficult to become hypoglycemic.
What is the difference between the endurance athlete and the explosive athlete, like even a rugby player or maybe even a sprinter in this sort of model?
Yeah, no, thank you. So now what Philip Prince is doing, what the next study we're doing, is we said, okay, if it doesn't work at 5Ks, what about 1K? So, sorry, 1 mile. So we're doing studies at the 1 mile, and I can't tell you the results, but I'm smiling so you can get the message. Because the results haven't gone through for publication as yet. And they're not complete because we've only done the first half. But if the second half holds up, there's some big surprises to come. And one of the benefits of the low carb diet is you lose visceral fat and you become thinner, and you cannot lose visceral fat on a high carbohydrate diet. So however athletic you are, if you're eating a high carb diet, you're carrying a kilogram, however lean and athletic you look, you're still carrying 1 or 2 kilograms of extra weight. And that's going to make a difference in all running events or cycling if you have to go uphill. That extra kilogram or 2 is going to make a difference. And let's remember, Chris Froome became the world champion that he is when he lost 8 kilograms by going onto this diet. And because that 8 kilograms just made him, he was a brilliant athlete, but he was just too heavy to be competitive. So that's one of the advantages. And I think we're going to find that there's no need for extra carbohydrate in the muscles for them to work perfectly well.
So just to touch on genetics here, because I obviously chat to people all the time and there's preference. So I personally battled to become a fat adapted athlete. I mean, even when I was training for that swim, I mean, I think I escalated my mileage faster than I could convert to becoming fat adapted. And I have many friends who've said even over 6 months. In fact, my sister-in-law, she trained for the Otter Trail and an African X. She's a big time trail runner. And she said when she was banting, she'd never felt so good in general. So sleeping better, like all sorts of, all the normal health stuff everyone reports, skin looking amazing, glowing, radiant, etc. But she said her running was like totally flat. She said she actually is the only race she ever conked out of was the Otter Trail marathon or whatever it is. But outside of that, she was really healthy. So is there a place where perhaps it's not ideal for athletic performance, but is good for health?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we don't know all the intricate metabolism of the muscles and how it can be different variants. There are so many variants. So yes, I've heard those stories and I believe them completely. And so I remember one guy who said he cut his carbs to 25 grams a day and he couldn't get out of bed in the morning. So I said, maybe you should increase the carbs.
Eat some carbs, yeah.
He went back to 100 and he was perfect. He started performing better. So yes, that's a very important point to make, that there is going to be individual variability and there are muscle variants. Let me give you an example. A guy came to us when I was still working at Sports Science and he said, alcohol makes me perform better. So we said, but that's not possible. He said, well, I've told the doctors this and they all said I'm an alcoholic. And he said, so what happened was he got drunk. He's got a muscle disorder. He said, there's something wrong with me, but I've got very bad endurance. And so he couldn't even swim 2 or 3 lengths of the pool without getting tired. So one day he was drunk the night before and he went and swam the next morning and he swam 10 lengths. And he said, something happened. And eventually he noticed that if he drank beer before he went and swam, he could swim further. So of course, this is nonsense, but fortunately being a scientist, we can test it. So we gave him placebo alcohol and proper alcohol, and he always performed better on the alcohol. But then we saw, then maybe he could smell it or something. So then we put a tube into his stomach. So he didn't know what we were putting in. And we would put alcohol in and he'd get better. And so then we did the final test, which was one of the funniest things we've ever done in my medical career. So we went to Critics Care Hospital and said, listen, we need some 100% alcohol. Why? No, because we need to infuse it into this guy's bloodstream. So they said, well, we can only legally give you 6 of these little tubes, because if you give him more than 6, he's going to die. Something like that. So we mixed up a mixture and we put them in an intravenous tubing and we mixed it with the saline. And I was in charge of delivery, rate of delivery, because if we gave too much, he might die. So I had to take responsibility. So we let it come in at a certain rate, and we noticed that he started to tire. So I decided, well, better increase the rate of pulling it in. And as soon as I increased the rate, he got less tired and he could perform better. So eventually we gave him all 6 vials, which was enough to make him absolutely intoxicated. It was as if nothing had happened. So he was utilizing this alcohol for his metabolism, and it was substituting for something else. And we never worked out what it was. But that's exactly your sister-in-law. Could have some defect of metabolism where she has to have carbohydrate. He had to have alcohol because he had some other defect. And the alcohol corrected that defect in some way. And your sister-in-law would be exactly the same. She needs carbohydrate to allow her muscles to work properly. And it would be fantastic to be able to find out what is that core, what is that mechanism.
You don't think that you just totally wiped out that guy's central governor system? So there was nothing telling him to slow down because you just turned off the switch.
Yeah, no. Well, I'll tell you what did happen. So that when we ran out of alcohol, he eventually collapsed, and it was astonishing. He would become completely paralyzed. So at the end of the exercise, normally if you finish exercise, you're exhausted, you're hyperventilating, and you sort of stumble off. This guy could not move. We had to carry him. So that was evidence that he has a muscle disorder, which was temporarily corrected by the alcohol.
Okay, so the last question really is around let's just get back to the blood glucose versus glycogen, which is quite a sort of, it's a thinker. But what is that? What are the implications for your diet? So what does one eat on the day of exercise or the day before? Or I'm kind of like, I'm a bit lost now, What does one do then?
Okay, so I think the evidence is if it's an endurance event, fat adaptation is beneficial because it's going to allow your brain to cope with the ketones. And, a lot of the people who tell us the benefits of the diet is they don't have to take all that carbohydrate all the time. They don't have to worry about where it is. And I suspect that they can actually get by without carbohydrates if they really wanted to, because the brain can be adapted. So you see, what the fat adapting diet does is it makes your brain more metabolically flexible. And that's the point we need to make. It doesn't just need carbohydrates. It can burn anything. It can burn carbohydrates or fat. So it's metabolically flexible. And in fact, that's what happens to your muscles as well. They become metabolically flexible. They're just not dependent on carbohydrate. So I'm talking biologically, the argument has to be very strong that now we know that in the vast majority of athletes, a high fat diet does not impair performance. Then there are many benefits for eating a high fat diet. So I think if you're fat adapted, you should eat a bit of carbohydrate the day before or the morning to keep your liver glucose filled. But you can do that perhaps by eating the night before and eating a breakfast of carbohydrates. Then you're in good shape. The problem is if you have too much carbohydrate, you secrete insulin, and then you kind of inhibit your own fat oxidation. But being fat adapted, the effect is much less. So my advice would be, if you're doing a marathon or ultra marathon, simply take some carbohydrate with you and take it at 30 kilometers and take 25 grams of carbohydrate at 30 and at 40 or 38. And that 100 grams is going to be, that 50 grams is going to be more than enough to prevent hypoglycemia.
Okay.
The other thing, of course, is to check your glucose, to get a glucometer and check and see what happens and become fat adapted. And you'll be amazed how far you can go without your glucose dropping, or conversely, if it does drop, you don't even notice it. Whereas before, if you're carbohydrate adapted, you'll notice any small drop in blood glucose. So I think we need to take carbohydrate out of the special place it has and say it's a supplement that you can add during exercise if you wish.
Yeah, there are going to be some sad pandas out there because, I mean, people still quite enjoy any excuse to have a pizza orgy or, pasta night. Yeah. So now what you're saying is you can have the rice, but just a little bit, don't go crazy. It's actually, what you're saying is less extreme on either side. So it's not like nothing, but it's also not the pizza. It's just, have a little carb, it'll help and carry on with your life. What happens with, so sorry, actual last question now this time, but the pizza, what was I saying? Oh, recovery. So there's this theory that there's this golden hour after exercise where it's best to have protein. And you know, and a lot of people say Stereo Stumpy is the best thing to have after a run. What is the best thing to do after any kind of exercise in that supposed golden hour?
Don't eat processed foods.
Yeah, that's the best thing to do every hour.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, so listen, you know, I'm guilty. So how could we afford to do all those fabulous studies which I told you about? We could afford to do that because we were funded by FRN, Leppen, the company Leppen that supported us, and then Bromore Foods supported us. So we got all the support for promoting carbohydrates. Now, all those studies you mentioned about how you get more quickly muscle glycogen resynthesis, so they're all funded by industry, and they're all done by scientists who are in my position. You had to do something to prove that the product was beneficial. Well, of course, if you take in a little bit of extra carbohydrate from some source, your muscle glycogen recoveries are going to be quicker. That you don't have to do a study to prove that. But the question is, what does it mean? Well, we've told you muscle glycogen is not important. So it doesn't mean anything. So that's the point. You know, I tell people the model that you use is critical. And that's when you interrogate people, you want to see what's the model that you come from. So if your model is that muscle glycogen is the central component in exercise, then you'll always do these studies and you'll always conclude that the carbohydrate was beneficial. Oh, you see, because glycogen went up, therefore performance is going to be enhanced. But they never bothered to do the studies. And so one of the studies that I found really interesting, because I finally exposed it, was one of the groups who are funded by Gatorade and the sports drink industry and have been the frontline people for them for decades. So they put people on a high-fat diet and compare them to a high-carbohydrate diet, and they measure their metabolism in the muscle and the enzymes that are involved in energy production. And guess what? They found they reduced under certain circumstances during exercise. They're slightly reduced. But when they do maximal effort, they're absolutely normal, which tells you that it's a regulation process. So what they're measuring as reduced during submaximal exercise is homeostatic regulation. The muscle says, I don't actually need to use these pathways. I can do it elsewhere. But because they fixed in the model, they say, yeah, you see there, the metabolism is interfered with, therefore the performance will be interfered with. And that's how they write the paper. The only problem was they measured performance in that study. And guess what? It was unaffected. But so when you look at the article, it says decreased PDH activity in skeletal muscle after a high-fat diet. And if you read that, you'll say, oh, you see, reduced PDH activity must mean performance is impaired. But they didn't find it impaired. So what they should have said, decreased PDH activity without any change in performance. But they left that out. And that paper is used by these people and by the industry to show you the high-fat diet impairs your performance. But it doesn't. And that's dishonesty. You know? And so that's how it works.
That's kind of how they did the, you know, like statins clinically proven to lower cholesterol, but no one bothered to find out whether like lowering cholesterol made a difference.
No, precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
So you've got the World Nutrition Summit coming up on the 24th, 25th, 26th of March, 2022. And the theme is universal truths / finding common ground. Why do you think this is important, and what are you excited about for this nutrition summit? The World Nutrition
Well, why I'm excited is because we get some of the best speakers in the world, and these are the skeptics, and they're the ones who question, and they're the mavericks, and all of us are exactly as myself. You know, we were sick and we changed diets and we got healthy, and then we realized that what we'd been teaching for so long was wrong. So these are the unusual people, and they don't just accept, and they debate, and we don't argue and say you're wrong and I'm right. We debate it in a civil way, and we allow people to have their opinion. And that's why I'm excited, because they just, you know, it's always been exciting. The low carb group is such a group of interesting, intelligent people, because it takes intelligent people to change. When they say I'm dying, I'm going to change, that takes intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Continuing and to kill yourself doesn't take intelligence. And so these people, all of them have been through exactly what I've been through, and challenged by their profession, and many of them have risked their careers. But we know what the truth is, and so we present it, and we have high respect for each other, and it's a loving atmosphere. I think, you know, one of the best talks I ever gave was unquestionably in Britain, in one of these low carb conferences, and I themed it around Liverpool because my parents were born in Liverpool, and of course, and I was introduced by Peter Bruckner, who was one of the doctors for the Liverpool Football Club.
Yeah, he was. Yeah,
you know all about him.
Yeah,
and he converted to this diet because of our book, and then he converted the Australian cricket team to this book, to the diet and a book, and I signed the book for the two key players in that team when they were here in Cape Town, and the two most delightful people you could ever meet. And one of them was the fast bowler, who was just the most terrifying visage when you watch him, and he was just like a puppy when we were chatting. So that was fabulous. But so Peter introduced me. So the last slide was "You'll Never Walk Alone," and the movie that came with the video, and the song by Jerry and the Pacemakers. And everyone got up and clapped and shouted and screamed and sung the song. And it was magic. And that's because we are, you know, you'll never walk alone in this field, because everyone's supporting us. And that's the atmosphere that you'll get at this conference. We're all in it together, and we respect each other. And because we know we're on the right train, we're going towards truth.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to doing my talk. I'm speaking with our psychologist, Victoria Webster, who's actually the sister of Chris, one of your researchers. Right. We'll be talking about the binge cycle. So we've learned a whole lot of stuff running programs for the last 8 years, and we'll be presenting a whole lot of our findings, not on a biological, not on the biology, but much more on the psyche, and just our experience with drop off and people not completing the programs, which is obviously devastating, but a reality in every weight loss program, not just low carb. So if you're watching this and you're keen to hear more about Prof's science and you want to see his slides, and I think the slides and presentations of up to 40 other speakers, there is a link in this talk, whether you're watching it on YouTube or Facebook. Click on the link right now. And if you haven't yet, press the share button and share this, because everyone needs to see this video. Prof, you are an absolute legend. Thank you so much for joining me. And I absolutely love your work, and I wish you all the best. I look forward to seeing you at the online summit at the end of the month.
Fantastic, Jonno. Thanks for a lovely interview. Great to chat to you again. Thanks so much. And I forgive you for writing the book that caused me so much trouble.